I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. There's an American professor here in the nation who's been delving into aspects of Korean culture that many Koreans themselves are not even fully aware of. He says that Korea, in a coming cultural renaissance this century, could very well play the lead role. We'll speak to him today about the cultural and intellectual potential that Korea possesses.
Professor Emanuel Pastreich teaches humanities and international relations at Kyunghee University. An expert in the literature and cultures of Korea, China, and Japan, Professor Passrush brings a unique perspective to Korean studies. Professor Passrush has been teaching in Korea for almost 7 years and has written, from an expat's point of view, 3 books about Korea and its potential. We've invited Professor Emanuel Pastreich, who has recently published his 3rd book in Korean.
Professor Pastreich, thank you very much for being on the show.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
And especially thank you because I'm sure you're quite busy these days promoting your new book. How do you like all the attention?
Well, it's been a great pleasure to speak with people like yourself who have shown an interest in this project of trying to recognize what it is in the tradition of Korea, which really deserves to receive attention globally.
And let's speak about the new book, which its translated title is A Different Republic of Korea, about which only Koreans are ignorant, a Harvard PhD's views on Korea's potential. Tell us, first of all, about the title. Where did that come from?
I wanted to write a story about Korea as number one, why Korea is such a sort of unique country and why it can be a model in many fields for countries around the world. And many Koreans were not really sure what I was talking about. So rather than write an English book, I started by writing a Korean book to talk about what Korea could be, the enormous potential. And that's what we mean by a different Republic of Korea, that tremendous potential that could be realized in this country.
Let's go back to the idea that you mentioned there briefly about how this idea came about for talking about this particular subject. Where did that come from?
Well, so I had in mind specifically, there was a Harvard professor by the name of Ezra Vogel who wrote a very famous book in 1979 called Japan as Number One. And until that time in the US and globally, most people, they drove Japanese cars, they watched Japanese TV, but they didn't really know anything about what Japan was. And this was the book that sort of laid out what Japan was exceptional in terms of administration, in terms of technology, culture, education, society. In the case of Korea, we find, ironically, even mysteriously, LG or Samsung or Hyundai have shown themselves to be global leaders. And yet if you go to a bookstore in New York or Paris and you're looking around for like Korean administration or Korean management skill or something like that, it just doesn't exist. It's like a blue ocean. And so we really need, I think, going forward to sort of focus on, one, what it is specifically Korea does well, and beyond that, because my background is actually not technology and it's not originally management either, it's traditional culture. I think there's a treasure trove there of potential within Korea's traditional culture.
And you speak in the book about something called the Korea Premium, sort of a play off of the Korea discount, obviously in the opposite way there. And you say that Koreans themselves haven't even yet discovered this quote-unquote Korean premium. Tell us about that.
Right, so there are all sorts of potentials. I mean that in a very general sense, the premium. So many potentials within Korea. So for example, if you sell a Korean smartphone, right, it has so far not really been linked to Korean culture per se, right? But there are many things in traditional culture and modern Korean culture which could be extended into technology to make it more sort of profound, a greater sort of cultural content. And we do see Koreans becoming aware of this need. But in terms of actually sort of rendering the full potential of Korea's culture, which goes back thousands of years, into actual products or opportunities, I think it's taking some time to see that.
And you obviously are coming from a foreigner's perspective. Perhaps,
I am. I won't hide that fact.
There you go. And perhaps you're saying there's a blind spot there, perhaps, for Koreans. So what are some of these things that do distinguish Korea from other countries, especially in this region?
Right. So there are several aspects to that. So in terms of contemporary Korea, Korea is a wonderful combination both of technology, which of course is extremely advanced, extremely good administration management skills and institutions, well-run government, and also culture that has both a deep culture and also a very dynamic and evolving one. And that's a very rare combination. And it finds itself in a very sort of strong geopolitical position. I mean, basically most countries in the world, feel positively towards Korea. I mean, you can see Korea maintains good relations with the United States, with China, with many other countries. There are occasional issues with Japan over specific issues, but in general has managed to maintain very good relations. So this is a really unique position for a country to be in.
In what ways would you say Korea distinguishes itself from those two, which of course are on opposite ends of Korea?
We do know that Korea more recently has gotten a lot of attention for the Korean wave, and there's a whole new generation of people who are very aware of Korea in the terms of Psy and other popular music and movies today. But there are some respects in which Korea has a bit way to go if you compare it with, say, China and Japan. And I would not say that so much per se as a country itself, but in terms of China and Japan, the literature, the art, the history has been studied and introduced abroad. I mean, people know who Confucius is, or they know what a samurai is. They know maybe even the tale of Genji from their high school or college readings. But when it comes to Korea, we really find it much harder, right? If you took a survey of like King Sejong or someone even harder, like I translated the works of Park Ji-won, Yeonam Park Ji-won, the writer, then we find that this really has not made that level. And I argue in the book that the popular culture part is obviously incredibly important, and in some ways it's the first step. But if you really want a long-term increase in cultural influence, which is, I think, essential for the next step in development, then you really need to start to get those other icons out.
And now you say now is the right time to take that next step. You talk about these icons that should be sort of promoted more globally. What are some of them? What are some of the more, valuable cultural assets or legacies that Korea possesses?
Right. So to some degree, this is an issue of imagination. We have to take, Korea has a long and very rich tradition, so we have to pick certain parts of it and imagine how they would serve in a role in today's society. So one example that I put forth is the story of the scholar, or what we call scholar, which the term in Korean is the Sunbi. So the Sunbi was not simply a scholar, right? It was somebody who was learned, who had a profound sense of sort of responsibility to society and to the people around him or her. And also the Sunbi was somebody who had a deep sense of ability for cultural expression through art, through writing, through song, through music. And so this idea of what the intellectual, what the educated person's role in society is, I think is extremely appealing. It's in a way, it's what we need today. So maybe the Sunbi, if we could do it right, could become that sort of icon for like what is the positive, this sense of responsibility to society, the idea of education and learning, and also this idea of sort of cultural expression.
Chuseok, one of the most important holidays here in Korea. You have another suggestion about that, saying that it could very well become an international holiday. Where did this idea come from, and why do you say that?
I've been to Chuseok events on many occasions, and for foreigners, it's wonderful to see traditional Chuseok rituals and eat the Chuseok food, but it's pretty much clear to us that there's no particular role for us in Chuseok, right? It's not our ancestors per se, and so it's limited. It's limited in what the meaning can be to us. However, Chuseok, it both needs to be considered for Koreans and also reconsidered in an international sense, which is to say, the whole point is to pay respect and to remember one's ancestors. So I think that could totally transform the holiday. That is to say, if Koreans start to think more Chuseok, not just a ritual, but to think, who was my grandfather, my great-grandfather, what did they do, how did they live, how does that compare with me? It could be a much more profound event, and that I think would make it much more appealing to young people. On the other hand, if we, non-Korean, non-ethnic Koreans living in Korea, are able to, say, pay respect to our ancestors, right, in the Chuseok ceremony, then it would become a universal festival. And if we went even further, be even more ambitious, we could say it could be global. So even somebody in Africa or South America might pay respect. You'd have a sort of a ceremony of like reading about your ancestor, your grandfather, what he or grandmother, what they did, and thinking about it. And that would be something like Thanksgiving, a sort of a universal holiday that everybody could participate in.
You've coined a different term, a new term in your book called the shrimp complex,
yes.
and you bring this up as well. Tell us a little bit about that idea.
So you've probably heard this familiar saying in Korea that Korea is like a shrimp between whales, imagining China and Japan or the United States and Russia. And of course, I'm not going to deny that in some geopolitical sense this is true, but Korea is no shrimp. Korea is a major player in many respects, and in some respects, if you compare Korea with, say, the United States or many other, Germany, France, is fiscally in better shape. It has better, Korean companies have more access to finance, has good technology and cultural content. So this is not a time to be sort of shrinking as a little shrimp next to the big whales. And I think that's, I use that to catch attention, obviously. But I think it's a fundamental paradigm shift. We had this problem with like Koreans who were very sort of afraid that America would be, putting all this capital investing in Korea. But in fact, Korea invests much more money in the United States than the United States does in Korea. But it requires a sort of a change of perspective to realize just how influential Korea has become.
So how do you achieve that change in perspective? And that of course, is the million-dollar question.
That's the million-dollar question.
Sure.
And, right. So there's no magic bullet per se. I want to sort of bring up some specific examples to get people to think about it. And I tried to be broad in my examples, not just to talk about, say, business or economics. So for example, if you take like a Louis Vuitton bag or something like that. So Louis Vuitton bag is a very popular item in the luxury market. And luxury market is one market which Korea is not competitive in now. Really, you don't have a Korean equivalent to Louis Vuitton. But I would argue that you could. It would require some investment. It would require some sort of reformatting and a little change in perspective. But for example, you have wonderful traditional clothes or things like the pojagi fabrics, which are extremely beautiful and have very unique patternings. And those could be used as the basis. Like the Louis Vuitton bag, right, which is based on 17th, 18th century leather traditions for like curing and also patterning. We could take those traditions from Korea and rework them into a form of, say, luxury dresses or bags or other things. And if properly positioned, totally competitive with Gucci or Louis Vuitton. But you can't do it unless you believe in it. You can't just fake it. You have to really think this culture has value.
So then where would the change begin? Is this a government-led initiative? Does it happen on a more base form? Where do you envision this sort of change
Well, you're asking
beginning?
me an incredibly difficult question.
Sure.
And I, in a way, I don't really, I think it would be a mistake for me to say, this is how you do it. Because ultimately, this is what Koreans are going to do. It's not, we can give some suggestions. We can, in a way, induce a response. I would say that's the point of my book. So it's like if you have a super saturated solution and you put a piece of sand in it, it will turn into it will gel, right? So I think Korea is super saturated. It has this enormous potential, incredibly high level of education, cultural attainments, technology, and then global economic business know-how and resources. And what we can do for our part is we sort of put that little piece in that will cause it to gel into form into something. How it gels, I think, is really up to Koreans. I think if we tried to micromanage that, we would probably not be successful.
Stereotypes can also have a negative effect, of course. What are some stereotypes that you see among Koreans or Korea in general that might be holding them back from the country back from making this progress?
Stereotypes about Korea itself?
Koreans in general about the sort of the shrimp complex you're talking about.
So the shrimp complex takes place at multiple levels. But let me just give the example of, say, Confucianism, which is one field that I have a little bit of knowledge about. So the traditional story is that in the Joseon period, there were all these Yangban scholars, and they were so interested in abstract Confucian thought that they let the world fall apart and they fell far behind. This is really not that accurate a story, and to some degree it's a story that was made up by Japanese scholars who were trying to explain why Japan had to modernize Koreans because they were so incompetent that they couldn't do it for themselves. But it was a powerful myth. And one of the results of it is that many Koreans have sort of dismissed the writings that were written in Chinese, in literary Chinese, up until the 20th century. Well, that's 95% of what was written, so that's a lot to lose, right? In fact, many of these great philosophers and writers wrote about extremely concrete, very meaningful things for everyday people. But because we tend to see them as being somehow Confucian, hard to understand out there, they really haven't been modernized, as it were. And so I think that's one of the major issues, that there's this sort of sense that we have to sort of, to become modern, which is good, we have to get rid of everything previous to, say, 1910. And that is just a mistake, I would say. There's a tremendous amount of potential in that past.
As an American expat in Korea, I'm sure you have your own opinions about this push by Korea for a multicultural society. What do you think Korea needs to do to create a more powerful multicultural community?
We hinted a little bit about that with the Chuseok story, right? How we can make these traditions one which are more expansive, right? That people can participate in. And I think that really is the essence of it, to say that we have all sorts of aspects of Korean culture which can be expanded so that essentially the Korean dream becomes the global dream, a dream of what could be achieved. The Sunbi, to say, a concern for family, for community, and also for the world, because Korea has this wonderful, what they call the Hongik Ingan tradition, a sort of embracing concern on a universal level. And we see that all the time in Korea. So Korea is both, it seems like a very closed country, but it's also an incredibly open one.
Now, we are in the so-called G2 era. Korea has a rich diplomatic history dating back centuries, of course. Are there lessons there that Korea could learn from its history, diplomatic history, that could help it navigate through this current G2 era?
There's a tendency, I think unfortunate tendency, globally to look at, say, issues with North Korea, China, and Japan just in the narrow sort of Cold War context, and to forget the extremely complex relationships between these countries over the last 2,000 years, with lots of precedents for how to resolve conflicts, how to move towards integration, how to handle various problems. to some degree, we have this sort of paradox that many of the people involved in international relations, say in Korea, even Koreans, they learned international studies, at Stanford or Harvard, and they learned about the Treaty of Westphalia, but they don't really know actually the whole tradition of how, say, the Qing dynasty or the Ming handled diplomatic relations, how the Chosun or the Song or, say, the Tokugawa, and there's, in those traditions here in Asia, there are many precedents for how to handle problems that are extremely valuable as we look forward to a very complex world.
Absolutely a loaded topic, of course, with a lot of intricacies involved. Before we go, what do you think we can do here in the country to better convey to the international community what Korea is and give the country the national brand that it so rightly deserves?
Right. So I'll count us all as we. I'll give you an example. So in the United States, there was a television show, maybe you watched it, called MASH. And this was a show about introducing Korea that was very popular when I was little, and maybe you saw it as well, in the 1970s and 80s. And it was about American military army base in rural Korea. It was a show in which all the Koreans were basically farmers. I don't think there was a single intellectual who showed up in the whole 10 years of MASH. And it gave a wrong impression of what Korea is. But in fact, it was the last time for many Americans, it was the last time that they ever saw anything about actually living in Korea. So we really need to get that other aspect of Korea out there to become truly visible. And I think we haven't even begun. If you read through, say, like the Wall Street Journal, the editorial page, you don't see editorials by Koreans in there, but you could. I mean, it wouldn't be that hard to translate the works of some important people here in Korea and get someone to do an excellent job in rewriting them and get them placed. It's just Korea hasn't really thought that Korea is playing on that level. But I assure you that other people around the world see Korea that way.
Professor Pastreich, we do appreciate you being on the show, sharing your insights. We, of course, encourage everybody out there to go pick up your book, A Different Republic of Korea. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, as always, for watching. We'll see you next time after 10.